think the developer has a good sense of how to make sure that there is a visual hierarchy where the things that it's important to pay attention to are obvious. A visual hierarchy is a term that comes mainly from graphic design. It's a really important concept for doing any kind of graphical thing in a game. When people are playing a game, they're not just looking at your art and thinking about how nice it looks or whether it looks like a realistic animation. They're also using your art to try and interpret what's happening in the game and what they should be doing. That's where this concept comes in handy. Now, visual hierarchy, my definition would be the way that different elements of an image are designed and arranged so that some appear more important than others. And by important here, I guess we mean urgent and something that the players need for the gameplay. You might make a beautiful background for your game that really adds to the immersion and just kind of the sense of being in a luxurious, high-budget game because it's got a beautiful background. But that's not important to the gameplay because it's not conveying as much information that's going to help the player to play the game. So just to go through some examples of things that you considered, the sort of things that might make something stand out in a visual hierarchy. You can think of things like size, the relative size of different things, how big are different things on the screen, and how does that impact what the player pays attention to. It could be looking at things like contrast and color. And one of the things that you can already see in this game that's doing very well is, although some of these kind of bullet hell projectiles that are moving around the level as part of the traps, although they're quite small, they are often very, very bold colors, and they are on a very cool and sort of darker looking background, which means that they really stand out. So even though they're smaller, the contrast and color helps them to pop out. The order of the visual hierarchy could also depend on things like proximity, like how close things are together. And one that we don't often see as much in graphic design, but is very relevant to games, is movement. Now, one example of this that happens a lot in games is something like coins going up in the corner of the screen. So if you are playing a game where you're running around collecting coins and you collect 100 coins in one go, it's generally good practice to, instead of just adding that 100 on in one go, you let the number cycle up. What that does is it creates a movement out the corner of the eye. Suddenly the player knows that that piece of information is more important, and they look up there and they can see that their coins are increasing. It's not just because it's a pretty effect. I mean, it does look nice. It also helps the player to recognize that something is happening and look up out of the corner of their eye and see it if they want to. If you just change it in one frame, they won't notice. So that's an example of how movement can push something higher up the visual hierarchy. To say something is higher in the visual hierarchy, it basically just means it's doing something to grab our attention. Whatever art style you're using, whether you're making a 2D game or a 3D game or whatever, the visual language that you develop as a game artist is going to impact this sort of stuff. So you're going to have to work out ways to make items stand out, and that might be something like, oh, your characters are more saturated and more colorful than the environment they're in. I think a really good game to look at from indie games for this is The Binding of Isaac. Look at the way that outlines are used. The characters and the most important objects, like the projectiles or things we can pick up, all have a thick black outline. They also have kind of a higher interior contrast, so the lighter and darker colors on these characters are kind of further away from each other in terms of brightness and so on. The other things in the scene do have outlines, but they are picked out in much more subdued colors. So these rocks in the level, they are blockers, you can interact with them, so they are kind of medium priority on the visual hierarchy. But these kind of more decorative objects like the rocks and some of the detailing around the edge, it doesn't use the thick black outlines. And the black outlines are reserved for the important characters, projectiles, anything dangerous, anything that's a treasure or a reward, and the things in the UI. So that pushes them to the top of the information hierarchy. So in the game I've been looking at today, in Robo Templar, I think the game developer is already doing a really good job of this, of building the information hierarchy so that, you know, you've got this cool dark background that allows the dangerous objects to pop out There's just a lot of good stuff going on there already in terms of making this make visual sense, because that's ultimately what visual hierarchy is about, making the image the player is looking at make immediate sense. And one of the tests you can actually do with a game to see if it has a decent visual hierarchy is something I call the squint test, and we can do it here digitally just by blurring something. But if I blur this image slightly, you can still pick out where the key things in the image are. In both of these cases, in both The Binding of Isaac and Robo Templar, I see quite a strong sense of this kind of need to make sure the image is easy to read. If you've made it all the way to the end of this video and you found it useful or helpful in any way, please do take a look at the other stuff on my channel. One of the things I do is I hand pick the suggested videos or playlists that come up at the end of a video to try and make them as relevant as possible to whoever the viewer of the current video is. So if you found this really relevant, do click on the links that come up at the end, because they are likely to be relevant to the types of questions that you have or the type of interests you have. Thanks for joining if it's your first time, and hope to see you around again.